Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is Paul Edgar moderating a conversation with Kurt Volker and retired General Tod Wolters about European security, particularly in light of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the longer-term impacts that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will have for regional and global security. And now on to the show.
Just to begin with, could each of you offer maybe a 3 or 4 minute synopsis on your view of the state of the Russia-Ukraine war, based on your particular experience, or emphasizing either the diplomatic or military components of it, or characteristics of the situation, at least as you understand it now? Ambassador Volker, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks all of you for coming. First, let me say I follow Ukraine and the war there and U.S. policy there very, very closely. I was the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019. One of the things that I worked very hard to do was to overcome the previous administration's arms embargo on Ukraine. There was a ban on providing lethal defensive arms. In 2017, we overturned that. We got them the first Javelin anti-tank systems, and I think that was turned out to have been a critical thing to have done. First, at the time, it unlocked other lethal defensive support for Ukraine once the U.S. moved. And secondly, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 22, the Ukrainians had the weapons, which, not enough and not everywhere they needed them and not everybody trained, but without it, you can just imagine, Russian tanks rolling in and none of the means to defend themselves. So that's the reason I have stuck with Ukraine, because you could see it coming and it's very important. Now, what's the state of the war? And this is different from what our policy should or shouldn't be, but just what's the state of the war? State of the war is that Russia has failed in its objective to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state and a national identity. And that is literally what it's about. Putin has been very, very clear. He does not believe that Ukraine exists as a separate national identity. He believes they're confused Russians who have been brainwashed by the West, literally his words. And he refers to Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians all as the so-called Russian people. So he denies the identity of Ukraine. And he's tried to extinguish it militarily. In areas that Russia occupies, they go to great lengths to wipe out the Ukrainian language, to erase evidence of history. The fact is that Ukraine predates Russia, but Vladimir Putin doesn't want anybody to know that. In that effort to eliminate Ukraine, he has failed. He has actually solidified a Ukrainian national identity. He has made that national identity stronger, committed to Europe, committed to NATO, and they have fought and protected the vast majority of Ukrainian territory, the capital, and forged what are now going to be permanent allegiances with the rest of Europe and with the United States. So in that broad scheme of things, Putin has failed and Ukraine has won, in that Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. And of all the territory that Russia took in early 22, Ukraine has taken about half of it back. So that's movement back against Russia's aggression. Today, however, you're not seeing any movement on the front lines. The Russians have had time to dig in and make it very, very difficult to dislodge them. The Ukrainians have also been able to hold the line where it is. Russia is having a very, very difficult and costly time trying to advance anywhere. And the nature of the conflict has now shifted, where the most important thing is actually longer range attacks. The Russians are attacking civilians. They're going after population centers and civilian infrastructure, particularly the energy infrastructure, but anything that they can hit, with missiles and with drones. Missiles of their own making, drones they get from Iran. The Ukrainians are using drones and longer-range artillery and longer-range missiles to hit Russian logistical supply lines, trying to disrupt Russia's ability to support its forces in the field. This is probably not going to change very much for at least the next year. I think we're going to see this pattern exist. But what we need to see during that year is Ukraine consolidate and strengthen its economy, strengthen its ties to the European Union and NATO, and begin to grow into that role of being a successful, sovereign, independent European democracy. And at some point, we'll figure out, is there a line, is there a border somewhere other than the 1991 borders? What is it? How does it stabilize? But that's not going to happen this year. And frankly, I guess the final thing I should say is that as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge of Russia, there will not be peace in Europe. And our job, NATO's job, the whole thing is about preventing war and maintaining peace in Europe. We're not going to get peace back as long as Putin is in power and as long as Ukraine is not in NATO. So that's where we have to get to, but we have a pathway to go through to get there.
Quick follow-on question to the period that you've covered. You went back pretty far, and some of your experience goes back to this period of transition. Can you talk a little bit about, there was a moment, we all make fun of President Bush. I looked into his soul, right? But there was actually a period where Putin spoke before essentially the equivalent of Germany's parliament, was very internationalist in his conversation, and everybody tended to trust him. And just a few years later, we saw some of the rhetoric that now we're seeing, not just the rhetoric, but the consequences of it. Can you talk about that transformation?
Yeah. And we have to ask ourselves, was it a transformation? Right. Because Putin, he cut his teeth as a KGB officer in East Germany. You can raise questions about who some of his people being handled might have been. And he was disgusted with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He believed that the Soviet leaders at the time failed to build on the strength of the Soviet Union. They were paralyzed by ideology. He thought that they were weak in standing up to the West. He came into office, if you remember when Putin took power, the Yeltsin era was basically one of openness in Russia and attempts at building a democratic system, but one that became increasingly lawless and corrupt and giving people a sense of chaos. Putin exploited that. In fact, people attribute to him bombings in some Moscow apartment buildings blamed on Chechen rebels in order to propel him as a strongman to lead Russia. He comes in as president of Russia. Early 2001 says that his mission is to restore Russian greatness. Now, those of us in the West at the time, and I was in the National Security Council at the time, we looked at this and we thought it was chaotic, and you do have to reestablish some law and order, but maybe on the basis of a new type of democracy in Russia, different from the Soviet Union. Give it a chance, and let's not be against them. Let's keep that door open. And I think that's what President Bush was trying to do when he first met Vladimir Putin, was not push him away. Try to keep the door open, say, look, we can work together. But I don't think Putin was ever in that mode. I think he was putting up a facade in order to keep the West friendly and relaxed while he worked to rebuild the intelligence services, the military, to reestablish major state-owned enterprises through which he could control the economy, and to start cracking down on political opposition in Russia, which he did all of those things. And I remember in particular, sorry to go on at length here, but I remember in particular going with President Bush to Russia in 2005. We always point to the Munich Security Conference 2007 as kind of as banging the shoe on the table moment. But in 2005, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And we went to Russia right after that. And President Bush goes out to his dacha outside of Moscow, and he has this big Siberian wolfhound. And he points to this and tells President Bush, bigger and faster and stronger than Barney. Because President Bush had this little terrier. And President Bush comes back after this meeting to, you're holed up in the hotel and all the secure communication stuff and all that. And he gathers Steve Hadley and Condi Rice, and I happen to be standing around. And he told this story, and he says, I want you to remember this. This is, the heart of who Putin really is. And it was from that point, I think, that Bush really understood that Putin sees himself as our adversary, and that he's going to do everything he can to oppose us. And it's what caused President Bush, even as early as 2008, to want to try to get Georgia and Ukraine into NATO.
I thought maybe you were also going to say that President Bush came back and said, when I get back to the White House, I want a bigger, faster gun. No, I'm kidding. General Wolters, how would you summarize where we're at now, or not where we're at, where Ukraine and Russia are at?
Well, let me start with the completion of this conflict is later rather than sooner. I was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe when it commenced in late February, and I've been asked 1,000 times, what did you do? What were you thinking? How did you prepare? And the first thing I'll say, which kind of goes back to some of the points that were previously addressed, this activity, this Russia-Ukraine build is really didn't commence in February of 22. It started in 2014. So we, the United States, and we, NATO, were very practiced from 2014 at the invasion of Crimea to well before the strike to be in a position to try to get as much of the right stuff and the right training to the Ukrainian military as possible. And just as Kurt alluded to, how this ends depends upon what the definition of winning is. And when you look at the definition of winning, you have to go back to the personalities in play. And just as was mentioned, Vladimir Putin looks at Ukraine the same way the President of the United States looks at Oahu. It's mine. And until Vladimir Putin is gone from the earth, he won't change his beliefs for all of the reasons that Kurt just alluded to. And I can reinforce those by saying the one individual that I worked with while I served as SACEUR, and I had 2 meetings in a quiet location with their chief of defense. His name is Valery Gerasimov, the highest ranking military member in the Russian armed forces. And oh, by the way, the one that is still in power and has been in power for approaching a decade as their chief of defense. And he is because he experienced and suffered the same decline in the Soviet Union that Vladimir Putin did, and he stayed the course in serving the Russian military through very, very thin times to the present. And Gerasimov, the numerous times that we met, looks at Ukraine the same way that I look at Oahu from a U.S. versus Russian perspective. They believe it is just theirs. And when you have that insight, you quickly start to conclude, you've got to have some very, very well-defined strategic instincts with respect to this conflict coming to a close. But as I've said 1,000 times in the past several months, this conflict is a big, big deal. It's a values conflict. It is a East versus West conflict. It is a we need to protect Western democratic values conflict. And how we do it is very, very important. And as we currently sit, there is nothing that I can see on the near horizon or the far horizon that says we are probably coming to a close fairly quickly. And having said that, we need to continue to contribute to Ukraine so that they can maintain positive, stable military campaign improvement over time. not overly concerned about spiking to great success by giving them something that they probably can't logistically support or they intellectually can't field, but making sure that those contributions over time allow the Ukrainian armed forces to have positive, steady military campaign momentum. And I agree with Kurt Volker's conclusion about where the conflict currently exists. There is some integrated air and missile defense and some air superiority challenges that both Russia and Ukraine have to come to grips with if they want to attempt to achieve success. And as most of us can tell, we're still a long ways away from getting there.
So you addressed a little bit, you mentioned we should continue to support Ukraine, and that's our response. Could we turn now a little bit to the European response, and we'll start with you, General Wolters. So 2 years in, how has the war shaped European security more broadly beyond those two countries? What are the most substantial military, political, and perhaps social, even social consequences? And you shared a little bit of that with us, with our students this morning. Maybe you can expand on some of those things.
Well, Paul, as a result of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, Putin got exactly what he didn't want. There will soon be 32 nations of NATO, as opposed to the previous 30. That there was the activation of the military forces that represented all 30 nations at the time to be galvanized and engaged and postured to defend European soil militarily that weren't there before. So those are very, very bad things for Vladimir Putin. The NATO solidarity increased as a result of the nefarious activities of Russia, also something that Putin didn't want. Inside of the continent, the subtleties that have allowed us to achieve, I would call, military success have to do with the awakening of Western Europe to work east and look east. So to take a look at what France has done with respect to their contributions to battalion-sized battle groups in the vicinity of Romania is unheard of. Right. For Germany to activate to the degree that they have, unheard of. For German, French, and northern nations to unite with the UK and develop coherent plans that protect the northeastern sector of Europe and the southeastern sector of Europe to a degree we haven't witnessed in my entire time in NATO. And all those activities increased the unity collectively of the alliance nations, and that is just something that Putin can't be very, very proud of, something that he didn't expect, and something that we have to continue to sustain. And the goodness in that is when you have Germany, UK, and France basically steaming in the same direction, you can get a lot out of those large nation unities with respect to longer strategic goals that you need to achieve, like maintaining the appropriate focus with respect to donations that go into Ukraine, as over time, some of the nations have a tendency to want to drift away from that focus, and those big nations will help in keeping us in a position to where our heads are still in the game.
That's actually a great way to transition to sort of the perhaps the political or diplomatic adjustments that have been made or are being made. So maybe, Ambassador Volker, if you could address that. We took about 20 students to NATO headquarters last June, and one of the things that the people we visited with drove home, and that we were trying to drive home to our students, is that NATO may be a military entity, but it's a military entity that's at the end of a string of almost 3 dozen political entities, and all of those operate so differently. So you don't grow your military without a political change domestically in each of these places. Can you talk a little bit about that, perhaps?
Sure. Well, first off, I just want to agree with General Wolters on the military impact in Europe of what Russia has done has been significant. And I don't think Putin expected it, as the General said. I don't think people fully appreciate it yet either. I mean, Poland's spending 4% of GDP on defense, some $40 billion defense budget in Poland. This would not have happened if he hadn't invaded Ukraine. Finland and Sweden and NATO, that would not have happened if he hadn't invaded Ukraine. But on to your question, the diplomatic and the political and the economic and all. Several other things have happened. So first off, Putin lost his gas market in Europe. They have moved on. And this is huge because this was his cash cow for rebuilding the Russian military, Russian intelligence services, for subsidizing the economy enough to stay in power. Everybody's off Russian gas now with a couple of minor exceptions like Austria. Everybody else has moved on. LNG is now the means by which a lot of gas is coming into Europe. Germany has 5 floating LNG terminals, US, Qatar, and so forth. Italy is trying to build more pipeline connections to North Africa and become kind of an energy hub, displacing what Germany and Austria had done with Russian gas. So that's major. That is major impact there. The European Union has realized that it is not safe. And that statement has lots of ripple or trickle-down implications. Russia's war against Ukraine is about empire and genocide, the kind of stuff that Hitler was doing in the 30s. And it doesn't stop with Ukraine. It just happens to be that's the theater right now. But it would affect Lithuania, it would affect Latvia, it would affect Estonia, it could even affect Finland, all of whom had been part of the Russian Empire, and now are not. And they realize that Putin will keep up this war in Europe as long as he can, meaning that Ukraine has to be secure. So President Macron last summer in Bratislava gave a speech, a conference called Globsec, in which he finally just laid it out on the table and said that France now supports Ukrainian membership in the European Union and Ukrainian membership in NATO, because that is the only way in which Europe will be secure and prosperous in the future. So this switch has flipped in European minds. Chancellor of Germany called it a Zeitenwende, a change in the times from where Germany had been before Russia's full-scale invasion to where they are now. And they pledged finally to actually meet 2% of GDP on defense and 100 billion euros in new defense spending in 1 year. That's significant. You have now the US and Germany as the two countries most cautious about Ukraine. And we're cautious because of concerns about the possibility of Russian escalation in the war. That is also a big shift. It used to be the US would be pushing our allies, do more here, do more there, spend more. We want to bring, Georgia, Ukraine, whatever, into NATO. Now all that's flipped. It is now our European allies that are pushing us to say, we need you to help us to try to stabilize things again. So those are all tremendously important shifts in the landscape in Europe, and I think we're still catching up with that. And final point that I brought this up in a call this morning as well. The mindset we have to have is that we are back in 1949, or maybe even in the 1930s before you get to 49. But we've been in this period where we've thought of dealing with NATO enlargement, dealing with the European Union, dealing with Russia in the 90s, the 2000s, even the 2010s, as we can work things out. Russia is a normal country. They have interests. We can negotiate these interests. We can work things out. But what we discovered in the 1930s is that genocide and imperialism running out of control can be very bad for everybody. And what we discovered, or what we concluded in 1949, was that we run the risk of another major war in Europe with Stalin, Soviet Union, Soviets occupying big chunks of Europe. So we need to actually form a defensive alliance to protect those that are not at risk now, meaning that we're putting ourselves at risk on purpose in order to create a stronger defensive whole so that we can actually prevent war in Europe. And that's the mindset we need to have now.
Is there, again, whether on the political side or the military side, are there, and I'm not just talking about countries in general, but actually specific leaders, European leaders, who have you found as really encouraging over the past couple of years, military leaders and political leaders that understand very clearly and kind of see the future and can kind of lead their military forces and their political forces in that direction.
Paul, you don't want to offend unnecessarily the NATO nations, but the truth of the matter is when you take a look at how NATO had to shift its military architecture to be more successful, you have to get the entire continent focused in the appropriate azimuth. And its azimuth had been to the south, towards Africa. Its azimuth had been back to the west, across the Atlantic. And the azimuth needed to be east. So you have two sectors, the Baltics plus Poland, and Poland is normally considered part of the Baltics. And then you have the very, very shifty part of southeastern Europe, which has the Western Balkans on its tail end to the west. But both of those entities in Europe needed to shine. And what we certainly saw out of Poland and Romania were two nations whose leaders were very, very focused on whole of government approach, all the way down to the military dimension, to make the appropriate advances, to be little Spartas, if you will, in the region. And I don't mean to say little Spartas, they were big Spartas, great contributors. They couldn't have that kind of success were it for the fact that both of those nations were smart enough to know to be successful as a nation in this region, I've got to be line abreast with my fellow geographical national partners, but I've got to be line abreast with all the activity in Western Europe. So what Germany was doing, what France was doing, what UK was doing, what was happening up in the north, all very, very important. And those two nations to me, and I was a 4-star commander in Europe starting in 2016 as the NATO AirCom and the U.S. Air Component Commander. I was with those nations day in and day out for 6 straight years. And those two nations in particular in their regions were exceptional in their comprehensive approach to defense and what they worked on from a whole of government to make sure that they could be as comprehensive as they could.
You know, working with the Poles in a number of different places, and then logistically with the Romanians, those are two countries that over the past 15 years or so, or even 20 years, I always found very, very encouraging. So that it definitely resonates. What about, do you have anything to add politically or other observations of who's really in practical ways leading?
Yeah, well, I'll be a little less diplomatic perhaps and name a few names because Boris Johnson really stood out in my view. He was first leader to go visit Ukraine after Russia's full-scale invasion. He was quick in making decisions and getting UK equipment into Ukrainian hands faster than the US. I talked about javelins, which we decided to provide in 2017, and they had a stockpile of these. Boris Johnson raced ahead of us and provided the NLAW, which is also an anti-tank system, very effective, and rushed them into Ukraine just before Russia's invasion and in the early months afterward. And the Ukrainians were ecstatic because they got a bigger supply of these very quickly. So I think, and this is actually interesting because the UK was able to do this because they had left the EU and they could make their own decisions, and they were interested in profiling themselves as good on the military and security side. So it paid off that way, and Rishi Sunak has continued that. So that's one. Ursula von der Leyen, she is the president of the European Union. President of the Commission. She has stood out as one of the strongest leaders in Europe since for the EU since Jacques Delors. She has created clarity of EU policy. She has a personal profile. She has run a tight ship with the Commission. She has spoken out, leading different policy areas. She has done very well. She will likely get reelected as the President of the European Commission again. And I mentioned Macron. Macron started off trying, he wanted to be the interlocutor with Putin. He was trying to call Putin up and, be the important person and Macron finally had it and said, okay, that's it. This guy is never going to stop. He's never going to deal with me. So I'm all in for Ukraine. And he has been since then. And that's interesting. And then I mentioned Scholz saying Zeitenwende. I don't think that Scholz has really risen to this as much as he could. But I'll tell you who has been very interesting is Giorgia Meloni in Italy, because everyone thought leading a far-right party into power in Italy, she's going to then pull the plug on Ukraine aid and try to make up with Vladimir Putin, or at least just get themselves out of this. And she has actually defined a way for people who are on the right in Europe to be supportive of these conservative and traditional values and policies in their own countries, like clamping down on immigration, while also being pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic, pro-EU, and pushing back on the threats to those things. So she has actually created a model that people didn't think existed, and I think that's going to be something we're going to see more of in the future.
If I could, Paul, just one point that I have to make. I feel obligated. There is one other protagonist in this entire discussion, and I agree with the ambassador's characterization of President Macron and everything that came out of Germany, and certainly from Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They were pivotal. The NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, the current one, he's been there forever, as many of you know. He's a former Minister of Finance in Norway, and then the Prime Minister. He's a money guy, but he's a great statesman and a great leader. In dealing with France and the UK and the NATO versus EU duplicity challenges, and how the euro and how the dollar are actually expended on planet Earth, and how you can keep the world rotating and keep it on axis from a security perspective. He's been absolutely masterful, and I would contend that that's why he's been there so long. The nations just don't want to let him go. He's able to take all of these variables that have impacted NATO and jump up to 70 to 80,000 feet and look at the entire globe and make sure that from a European perspective, there's some semblance of alignment with activities in Africa, the Middle East, and certainly the Asia Pacific. He has been absolutely astounding. And number one, his endurance, and number two, his intellect. And he's marched down the path of having to work with some difficult U.S. presidents who have represented two ends of the spectrum when it comes to security activities, and he's done the same with other nations. He's been a powerful figure at keeping a modicum of calm that still exists in Europe, and of course we all know that can change in a second, and it's still not as calm as we'd prefer. But I think Jens has been phenomenal in his performance as the NATO Secretary General from a global perspective.
Well, thanks for that, and it's actually a great segue. Let's turn a little bit towards American audiences, and one of the if you're watching NATO. If you're watching UN and NATO, some of these bodies, simply from American news, sometimes you can get really frustrated, right? So could perhaps each of you talk a little bit about the standard, the standard of consensus in NATO, and perhaps argue a defense for it for an American audience? Mm-hmm. General Wolters, why don't we start with you on that one?
As all of you know, NATO it's very complex and very complicated. It's the greatest alliance in the history of humanity. It's irrefutable. I was a young fighter pilot that spent the first 10 years from 1982 to 1992 flying fighters in West Germany. And during that time frame, when I was going to get airborne to fight the East Germans, I was going to go to the merge, that's where these aircraft meet to shoot each other, over the Fulda Gap. And I was going to be outnumbered 3-1. Eastern Bloc nations versus NATO nations. As the years have gone by, NATO's put the current aviators that represent the NATO nation militaries, if we have that same engagement, the NATO fighter forces outnumber the Russian forces 3-1. So that is something that most citizens of the United States don't look at, but that's the improvement that NATO has demonstrated over time. It is very, very difficult to fight in a large alliance. And the big joke is if you don't like NATO, just go through life without it. You have to have full national consensus. You have to understand who's in charge. And when Kurt Volker was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, he was part of a command chain called the North Atlantic Council. It's the ambassadors that represent the nations at NATO headquarters who are the decision body of making all decisions for what NATO does, military and beyond. It's not the Secretary General, but the Secretary General is extremely important in gaining consensus with the countries and with those ambassadors who work with their presidents and prime ministers to make those decisions. But the bottom line is, without NATO, we would have lost the Cold War, and the Cold War would have quickly appeared as a World War II or worse with respect to loss of life. And because we didn't have that occur, we contend that's a pretty good issue. But it is by, with, and through the nations for any activity, and it is soon to be all 32 nations have to have agreement on where you go. And you can quickly take a look at Turkey, Greece. They have some challenges. You can quickly take a look at France, Germany. They have some challenges. And you can take a look at what the UK does, not being a member of the EU, and other nations that have EU membership and that don't. But it is big. It doesn't move as fast as we would prefer. But once it makes a decision, the power of those soon-to-be 32 nations, which involves over 1 billion citizens, which involves hundreds and hundreds of thousands of military members, is still an organization that certainly carries its weight with respect to delivering more peace in certain regions across planet Earth.
Good answer.
I'll add a couple things to that. When I was ambassador, I used to joke that people say, "Oh, isn't it difficult getting consensus among 28 countries?" which is what it was then. And I said, "No, not really. Basically, if you get Greece and Turkey, France, the United States, you've cracked the code. You know, that's all you need. Everyone else will be in that box somewhere." That's not quite the case anymore. We have Turkey and Hungary are the ones that are on people's minds. And Turkey, I am fundamentally positive about. I think that they live in a very special region. If you stand in Turkey and you look around, you've got the Black Sea, you've got Ukraine, Crimea, you've got Russia, you've got Central Asia and the Caucasus. You've got Iran, Iraq, which is both the Kurdish region of northern Iraq as well as the rest of Iraq, but Iran is the real issue there. Then you've got Syria and different Kurds, Syrian Kurds. And then you've got the Eastern Med, including energy and oil and gas resources. And if you think about what are Turkish interests here, first off, they're serious, they're difficult, they're complex, they're hard security issues, refugee issues, economic issues, energy issues. And secondly, if you think, well, what are the Turkish interests here? U.S. interests align with Turkey's on that panorama about 90% of the time. So we may not like Erdogan, we may not like his style, he arrests too many journalists, but we need to be able to actually have a strategic partnership with Turkey. And I think we've neglected this over time. Turkey makes it hard, no question about it. The hardest friends in the world to have. But we should be friends. And that is something I think we've messed up. With Hungary, I think Orban is messing up. I think that he's taken an extreme position of wanting to be the contrarian in Europe against the US, against Brussels, and being a free rider, basically, knowing that the EU and NATO are actually going to take care of the economy and security in Europe, so he can then do the side deals with China and the side deals with Putin, and that's destructive. And I think he's gone off in the wrong direction. Now, this is not the first time we've had issues within NATO. We had Greek colonels running a military government in Greece. We had a Greek-Turkish almost war. We had Portugal as a dictatorship within the alliance. So we've had to handle these things before. I'm sure we can handle this. And the final point about consensus, which I believe is important, we're talking about the willingness to put anyone's soldiers' lives on the line for the collective defense of everybody. You can't be outvoted and then be expected to commit to do that. You have to be part of the decision. And that's why it makes sense for NATO to make decisions by consensus, because you have to get everybody committed. If you don't do that, then they're not committed, then you don't really have an alliance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.